My name is Adam, and I'm 28 years old. I used to think my future was set in stone, that I had all the answers about life, faith, and what comes after. But everything I believed was shattered in one night, one moment, really, that changed me forever. If you're here, if you've stumbled upon my story, I don't believe it's by accident. Something brought you here, just like something brought me back. This is my near-death experience, and it isn't just a story. It's my truth. I grew up in a traditional Muslim family, the kind that practiced our religion with sincere devotion. My parents were both immigrants who worked tirelessly to give me and my younger brother every opportunity. From an early age, I learned to recite the Quran in Arabic, even before I could fully speak my native language with confidence. For as long as I can remember, I prayed 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan, and never questioned the faith I'd inherited. My parents named me Adam in honor of the very first man, a name that carries deep significance in Islam. I wore it with pride, believing it connected me to my heritage and to Allah. Religion wasn't just an aspect of our family life, it was the foundation. We prayed together, recited the Quran together, celebrated Eid together. Everything in our home revolved around our Islamic identity. Like many who grow up in devout families, I never felt the need to challenge any of it. In my mind, Islam was the final revelation from God, the completion of all previous messages. I was taught that Christianity and Judaism were part of a lineage of truth that was somehow corrupted over time. We believed Muhammad was the last and greatest prophet and that the Quran was protected from error. Questioning these beliefs didn't cross my mind. My life was stable, predictable, and I had no desire to look outside the clear path I thought I was on. But no matter how certain you think you are, life has a way of turning certainty into dust. My wake-up call came late one afternoon, right after work. I'd had a normal day at the office, nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. My thoughts drifted to what I'd have for dinner and the plans I'd made for the upcoming weekend. The city was as busy as ever. Cars racing to beat yellow lights, people darting across crosswalks, and the constant hum of horns echoing off tall buildings. I never saw the other car coming. The impact was so sudden, so violent, that I had no time to react. 1 second I was gripping my steering wheel, and the next I heard the deafening crunch of metal against metal. My world spun in a burst of chaos, broken glass, screeching tires, and the terrible thud of my body slamming against hard surfaces. I remember hearing a loud ringing in my ears, like every sound had converged into one high-pitched note. Then, silence. It was the strangest feeling. I braced myself for crushing pain, but it never came. I felt weightless, like a feather drifting on a breeze with no place to land. Confused, I tried to move, nothing. I tried to scream, no sound. When my vision cleared, I realized why. I was outside my own body. I saw myself slumped against the driver's seat, blood trickling down my forehead, my eyes half open and glazed over. It looked like something out of a movie, except this wasn't fiction. It was me, my physical body, broken, lifeless. I remember trembling, even though I no longer had the same sense of a physical form. I knew I had to be hallucinating. My rational mind shouted that I was in shock, that the trauma from the accident had thrown my brain into some kind of delirium. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. When I reached out to touch the car, my hand passed right through the wreckage like it was made of mist. The panic set in. Bystanders rushed toward the crash. I watched them kneel beside my body, calling 911 and shouting for help. One woman pressed her hands against my chest, desperately trying to do something, anything, to revive me. But I knew, just by looking at myself, that I was gone. There was no heartbeat, no spark in my eyes. I felt completely detached, like my essence was somewhere else, floating above the scene. Then, I felt it. A pull, an invisible force stronger than gravity, tugging at me. It clung to my being, drawing me away from the street, away from my body, and away from everything I'd ever known. I tried to fight it, but there was nothing to grab, nothing solid to hold onto. The world I was leaving behind started to fade, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the shouting voices of onlookers, the neon glow of the city. All of it slipped away into darkness. I expected something, maybe angels as I'd been taught, or a bright tunnel of light, or some sort of gate leading to paradise. Instead, I found myself drifting in an endless void. It was dark, but not just a simple darkness, more like an infinite expanse of nothingness. My mind raced back to the Islamic teachings about the moment of death. We're supposed to be greeted by angels who question us, who ask who our prophet is, who our God is. But there were no voices, no forms, no comforting presence at all. The panic rose inside me. If this was death, why did it feel so empty, so lonely? Wasn't Allah supposed to be near, sending angels to take my soul? Where were they? Just when I thought I'd be trapped in that formless darkness forever, something changed. The emptiness split into what felt like a pathway, a kind of tunnel, though not visible in a physical sense. This invisible corridor was pulling me along, rushing me forward like an undertow in a violent ocean. I wanted to scream, but there was no sound, no air, no sense of having lungs to breathe with. Suddenly, a presence filled the space. It was vast, all-encompassing, and impossibly powerful. It felt like being in the center of a massive storm, yet there was a deep sense of knowing that this presence was aware of me. Personally, I had felt something of the divine during my prayers before, moments of closeness to Allah. Or so I had believed, but this was on an entirely different scale. It was overwhelming. And that was when I saw him. I knew who it was before I could even form the thought. Jesus, not the Isa I'd learned about in the Quran, the mere prophet who was overshadowed by Muhammad's final revelation. This was someone entirely different, someone whose presence carried more authority and love than I'd ever encountered. It was as if every cell of my being recognized him instantly. I crumpled, or at least it felt that way, as if I fell to my knees, though I wasn't even sure I had knees in this form. I couldn't stand in his presence. It was too immense, too holy. And when he spoke, my soul trembled. "Adam," he said, calling me by the name I'd known my entire life. His voice was filled with both sorrow and compassion, like he was grieving for me, yet deeply concerned at the same time. "You have been deceived." Those words tore through me like lightning. Some part of me had always worried, what if I'm wrong? What if the things I've been taught aren't entirely correct? But I'd always silenced those thoughts with more prayer, more reading of the Quran. Now, hearing it from Jesus himself, I couldn't brush it aside. I tried to argue, but the words sounded hollow even to me. No, this can't be. Islam is the truth. We have the final revelation. Muhammad is... Jesus lifted his hand, and the entire scene around me shifted. In an instant, I was taken through time, through events that felt hyper-real, more vivid than anything on earth. I found myself in a place that looked ancient, dusty roads, stone buildings, the kind of setting you might see in a historical documentary about biblical times. Then I saw him again, Jesus, but this time he was beaten, bloodied, carrying a large wooden cross. Soldiers whipped him, mocked him, and forced him to walk while crowds jeered or watched in shock. I watched, horrified, as he stumbled up a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. I saw the nails driven through his wrists and feet, the cross raised with his body hanging upon it. This was the crucifixion I'd always believed never happened. Islam had taught me that Jesus was not crucified, that it was only made to appear so, that maybe God rescued him before the worst could happen. But I was seeing it with my own eyes, his suffering, his final breaths. The ground shook, the sky grew dark, and I witnessed the veil of the temple being torn in two. This was no mere execution. Nature itself reacted to his death. And then, just as quickly, the vision jumped forward. I saw the tomb. The stone rolled away. The resurrected Jesus standing before his followers, showing them the scars on his hands and side, speaking comfort to those who feared everything was lost. I had always dismissed the idea of Jesus as the Son of God. I'd believed he was a revered prophet. No more. He had died and risen again, and the power of that moment radiated through everything I saw. Then the vision shifted to a desert scene. A man preached to people in the harsh sunlight. I recognized him immediately as Muhammad. I watched as his followers grew, as Islam spread across nations. But through new eyes, I noticed things I'd never noticed before. Distortions, changes to what Jesus had originally taught, an entire structure built on half-truths and omissions. I saw how generation after generation was raised to believe in a version of Jesus that omitted the cross and the resurrection, the very core of salvation. It felt like someone peeling back layers of reality, exposing the hidden roots beneath. I saw spiritual forces, dark and serpentine, fueling the spread of misinformation and binding people in chains of ignorance. This wasn't just about a competing religion. It was about a strategic deception orchestrated over centuries. I saw that billions of people, including me, had been caught in it. My heart shattered. I wanted to rage, to cry out at the unfairness. How could so many people, so sincerely devoted, be led astray? Why had my own prayers never revealed this truth? Why had I never questioned? The weight of sorrow pressed on me, realizing the depth of the lie I'd once called truth. Jesus stood before me again. His eyes held a sadness I cannot describe, yet also an unmistakable love. In that moment, I understood that his sorrow was not just for me, but for everyone still trapped in deception. Then he lifted his hand once more, and the vision soared forward in time. I witnessed a future I could hardly believe. In places where Islam ruled with an iron grip, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, people began hungering for Jesus. Quietly at first, in whispers, families would gather in secret to read the Bible, to watch testimonies on smuggled devices. Then, like a spark in a dry forest, entire communities turned to Christ. Mosques that once overflowed with worshippers grew empty, replaced by small underground fellowships. The authorities tried to stamp it out, but they couldn't stop the flood of conversions. I also saw resistance surge with terrifying force. Governments enacted harsher laws, families disowned relatives who left Islam, mobs violently attacked Christians. The spiritual darkness behind these actions became visible, powerful beings orchestrating chaos to hold on to what they were losing. Yet for every act of persecution, faith grew stronger. Those who embraced Jesus refused to turn back, even under the threat of death. My vision took me through riots, collapsed governments, and a charismatic leader rising to promise the old world back. But behind him, in the shadows, I saw the same dark forces at work, whispering lies, stirring hatred. The earth was shaken by a war far bigger than any physical battle, the war of truth against deception. When my perspective finally settled, I stood there, trembling. I had seen too much to remain silent, too much to pretend I could go on living my old life, and somehow, deep inside, I knew what was next. Jesus had brought me here not just to show me these revelations, but to commission me. He looked at me with eyes that penetrated every lie I'd ever believed. There was no condemnation in his gaze, only sorrow at the thought of me rejecting what he offered. I felt a peace so overwhelming that I never wanted to leave his presence. but I sensed that he was giving me a choice. My soul cried out, "I don't want to go back, not after seeing the truth. I don't belong there anymore." But in the silence that followed, I heard the answer in my heart, "You have a mission." And then everything vanished. I woke up in a hospital bed, gasping for air like I'd been underwater for hours. My vision was blurred by fluorescent lights, my ears echoing with the beeping of medical machines. Sharp pain racked my body, but all I could think was, I'm alive. Somehow, I'm alive. My mother was the first face I saw. Tears streaked her cheeks, and her lips moved in prayers of gratitude. She clung to my hand as if I might disappear any second. My father stood nearby, arms folded, his eyes clouded with concern. My younger brother hovered in the background, looking more shaken than I'd seen him. Doctors came in, talking about the severity of my injuries, how they'd been unsure if I would pull through. They hinted that it was a miracle. I knew exactly what they meant. Once the medical staff left, my family gathered closer. They expected me to break down in tears of relief, to thank Allah for saving me. Instead, I blurted out something that changed our relationship forever. I died. I said quietly. I saw Jesus. The air turned heavy. My father's expression morphed from relief to confusion, then to anger. My mother tried to calm me, insisted I must have been hallucinating. But I shook my head. It wasn't a dream, I insisted, my voice cracking with urgency. Islam doesn't have the answers we think it does. Jesus is the Son of God. I know it sounds impossible, but my father's hand slammed against the bed's metal railing. Enough, he barked. Don't speak such blasphemy in this house. But we weren't at home. We were in a hospital room. And it felt symbolic of the fact that I would never truly be in the same house again, spiritually or emotionally. Over the next days and weeks, tensions rose. My father alternated between cold silence and heated arguments. My mother cried more than I'd ever seen, constantly praying that I'd return to Islam. My brother avoided me, offering only pitiful glances from across the room. I knew what was coming, because in my vision, I'd seen it all. The rejection, the sense of betrayal, the anger, the fear of shame I was bringing on the family. I also knew I couldn't stay. The moment I confessed Jesus as Lord, the invisible line had been drawn. I could pretend to renounce what I'd seen and keep the peace, but that would be a lie. I couldn't unsee the truth. So one night, not long after I was discharged from the hospital, I packed a small bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to go. My father watched me from the doorway, arms crossed, a tear in his eye that he refused to acknowledge. My mother sobbed into her scarf, but she didn't stop me. She knew there was no going back. At first, life was a blur of uncertainty and isolation. With no support network and little money, I bounced between cheap rooms, occasionally sleeping in my car once it was fixed, or on couches offered by acquaintances who had no idea why I'd left home. But I couldn't hide my story. It burned inside me, demanding to be shared. Slowly, I found people like me, former Muslims who'd had dreams, visions, or experiences that led them to Christ. They understood the heartbreak of losing family, friends, and community. They also radiated the same unshakable conviction that I'd felt since waking up in the hospital. We studied the Bible together, some of us seeing its pages for the first time in a new light. Every passage about Jesus' death and resurrection jumped out at me, confirming what I'd witnessed. I started telling my story, first in small groups, then in larger gatherings. I didn't hold back on the details. People needed to know. Some listened in awe, others looked at me with suspicion or anger. I was accused of lying, of working for some anti-Islam agenda. I received threats, warnings, but also quiet, tearful confessions from people who said they too had doubts about Islam but never dared speak them aloud. They asked me to pray with them, to show them How to Find Jesus.